Hello everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of Enterprise Cybersecurity Fundamentals, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward, and I'll be your MC today and for each webinar in this series. Your mentor is Matt Constable, who I will introduce shortly. Before we begin, as this is the first webinar, just some housekeeping for you all. All webinars for this course will be held at 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, with recordings made for those of you who cannot attend on a given night. Despite the recordings being available, if you can make it, we really do hope that you'll attend the live webinars and contribute to a collaborative learning environment through the chat and asking questions. We think it's really valuable and can often sort of, whilst it might go in, might lead us down tangents, we think that those tangents are really useful and make sure that everyone's continually engaged and covering different things to what we might actually have covered in the first place. On your contribution, for those that have not used Zoom before for webinars, just a few words on its functions. As I said, we strongly encourage the asking of questions and the use of chat during the webinar, and we have two ways to do that. First, if you check down the bottom of the Zoom window, you will find a set of icons you can click on. There you can find buttons to open questions and chat function boxes. And we ask that you direct all course content related questions or questions directly relating to what Matt is talking about to the Q&A box or section. And for more course administrative type questions about how the course will run or when the exam is or when recordings or slides will be available, etc. If you can send those in the chat for the support team to answer. In the chat, you can chat with panelists only or to all of your fellow students as well by toggling through the drop-down box once you have opened the chat log. And we recommend choosing all panelists and attendees so everyone is in the loop. There are usually some very experienced and industry-based students listening in as well, and they might be able to help answer any questions and indeed just have a good, interesting chat on the side as Matt's delivering his presentation. For those who've never taken part in a short course with us, IT Masters is a training organisation that exists as a partner to Charles Sturt University, who we work with to create and deliver a number of their master's degrees. We also market these courses on their behalf and think and hope that the best way to do that is to give some of that content away free. If we do a good enough job, then students will be encouraged to enrol in the full masters if it suits them, and we just sort of think that it's a win-win situation. Give away a free short course and maybe we get a bit of marketing out of it too. With all of that said, we do hope that the courses stand alone in their own right and are their own reward. We want you to learn some useful information, have a bit of fun while learning, and hopefully make connections with your fellow students both during the webinars and in the discussion forums at the learn.itmasters webpage and on the course page. Next week, we will be joined by someone from CSU to explain more about their master's programs, but for now, we'll just stick with this tonight. Diane from IT Masters is online to help in administrative support role, and she'll be responding to questions in the chat with me. And she's also responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website. We'll send a link for that through in the chat soon, and that's where you'll find all the other materials for this course. The recordings of lectures, discussion forums and quizzes, and also Matt's set readings. If you have any questions today or later on, please feel free to contact us using the details on that page. I'll hand you over now to Matt Constable. Matt is a senior networking and cybersecurity lecturer and subject developer. He's run a number of these short courses for us before, and they consistently rate amongst the most well received and have some of the largest cohorts. So I think we're in good hands for the next 4 weeks. So could you please all welcome Matt Constable.
Thanks very much, Guy. Wonderful introduction as always. So welcome everybody to our first week, Enterprise Cybersecurity Fundamentals. So this is going to be a pretty quick 4 weeks. It's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride in some respects, and there's a lot of stuff that we get to talk about, but it's some really interesting things coming up in the next 4 weeks, and hopefully something that you guys can really get your teeth into and generate some good discussions about. As Guy said before, our forums on the Moodle website are really, really important for you to engage in. There's some good questions on there that that are available to answer questions about the content for each week. And I really encourage you to get engaged in those questions and in those forums, because the learning experience will be so much richer for you if you to do that. So, all right, let's kick on. So, as Guy alluded to, this subject is based on the IT Masters subject ITI 581, IT Security Fundamentals, which is part of a couple of master streams there. And I notice in the cohort there's a few familiar names to me from previous subjects. So welcome to all of you who already know me. And for those of you that don't, we will have a look at that. That's me there. So I'll leave you to read through that in your leisure time once you've got access to the slides. Basically, I've been around the bush a little bit, done lots of different things, and have been working with IT Masters on and off for 12 years. Yeah, 11 or 12 years, and on a more permanent basis over the last 4 or 5 years. As Guy said, doing various subject delivery and subject development as well. So it's been a lot of fun. These MOOCs are generally a lot of fun, and I like to keep them fairly informal, and I like you guys to ask lots of questions. So by all means, don't hesitate to ask any questions at any time. I'm happy to stop at any time to ask questions if there's a bit of build up. So just make sure that you direct those to the Q&A box, because I'm not actually looking at the chat, because that tends to distract me. So I'll just look at the Q&A. All right, so class times, as Guy said, 7:30 on Wednesday evenings for the next 4 weeks, and we'll get those the recording up available to you through the online web portal as soon as possible, within a short period of time, for those of you who can't attend to actually have a look at and get your head across what's going on. Easiest way to contact me is via the course forums. And that way, much preferred you do that, because that way then everyone can engage, everyone can see what your questions are. And look, I didn't dwell on it back there on that slide about me, but down at the bottom I've just written, everyone brings something to the table. I don't know everything. So there will certainly be questions, as Guy said before, from out there in student land where you guys are watching from. There'll be some very experienced individuals out there who will have questions that I potentially may not be able to answer. Hopefully together we can get those answers, and if not, I'll go off, find them for you and get back to you as soon as I can. So please engage in the forums as much as you can. Just a quick question there, I see from Fazlal, you don't need any network experience, no, to be able to go through this online course, no worries at all. So the learning resources are mainly on the online portal, which is here. Okay, so this is the main page for the this particular online course. If you haven't got access to this already, information about that will be coming out shortly, but I'd be surprised if you haven't. So please log on to this particular web portal and have a flick through the information that's there. So first week we have a study guide, which really just gives you some pointers on what you need to, oops, I've timed out. Don't you love that? Always works when you're trying to, never works when you're trying to demo. Murphy's Law.
Always.
I've got to log in about 4 hours ago. So there it is there. So that's a study guide. What we're going to talk about in this particular week. So all these topics here, we'll have a look at in the next hour and maybe a little bit more. And then there's some module tasks that you need to go on. So main one is to watch the recording or attend this live tutorial, read some of the provided materials, which I'll show you in a minute, post your module discussion. There's some questions for each week that you need to engage in. Help to consolidate your learning and also help to generate some conversation amongst you as students, because you've got a magnificent resource out there with over 3,000 of you currently registered to do this online course. You've got lots of expertise out there. Use it as much as you can, and doing that using the forums is the best way to do that. And then there's also a quiz for each week. So if I just jump back again to module 1. So there's the webinar slides. So they are the slides that I'm going to go through this evening. They are there for you to access and to have a look at in your own time, or in association with listening to the webinar in the background, should you want to do that if you don't actually want to watch it so much directly. We also have some module readings for each week. Okay, so there's a number of different resources. Some of them are links, some of them are PDFs that are designed to help you consolidate the learning within that particular week. Okay, I'm not expecting that you go through and read it page for page. Some of the content that you'll go through, you will find, oh yeah, I know that, I'm familiar with that. That's fine, that's okay. For those of you that aren't familiar with the content each week, these readings are there to help you build up that knowledge and to build some links so that you do begin to really get it rather than just being familiar with it. And then last of all, there is the discussion points. Okay, so there are a number of questions or discussion prompts, as we've labeled them here. So there's the 3 for this week. And I've really encouraged you to make a posting for each of those. It's not compulsory, but certainly make a post on each of those and take the conversation as far as you can, because it certainly will assist with your learning. And then there's the module quiz. There are 5 questions, 5 multiple choice questions in each quiz. And as it says there, you need to score better than 3 out of 5. Basically, it's a participation mark. So you have to tick that off, because if you scroll out down the bottom here, in mine, you'll see that you have to have all 4 quizzes marked as complete in order to be able to get access to the final exam in week 5. So after our 4 weeks content. So you have to do the module quizzes in order to be able to get access to that.
And I'll just add, Matt,
Yep.
so just to mix sent in
No,
the
sure.
question at the same time, and there's no expectation to do that before any webinars, just you will need to do it before you do the exam.
Oh yeah, yes, yeah, thanks Guy. Yep, absolutely. So don't have to have it done, you can do them all at the end before you do the exam if you like, that's fine. The other thing I'll point you to is that there's also a folder for extra resources for those of you that are particularly enthusiastic. And in here are a number of ebooks that will help to, again, consolidate some of the topics that we talk about. And there's some really interesting reads there and worthwhile having a look at, but don't stress if you don't read them all in the next 4 weeks. That's not the intention. The final exam is a 40-question multiple choice, okay, but multiple choice, not necessarily one answer per question. So there may be, there's 4 options for every question, but there may be some questions which will ask you to choose all that apply, or choose 2, or choose however many. So be careful that you make sure you read the wording of the question, which will give you a hint, point you in the right direction to how many answers you're expected to knock off. Okay, so that's the web portal. And then there's activities, as I said, the form activities and the quizzes to really get you going into that. And in other, depending on what we're talking about each week, as Guy said, we may go off on tangents. I tend to do that a lot. So we may go off on tangents and we may end up talking about something slightly differently, but we'll try to keep on topic as much as we can. But sometimes those tangents are really, really valuable. So we'll go off down that track as well as at different times. I've also got some study tips here for you, which have been designed or come up by a university professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He did a number, I can't remember his name at the moment, unfortunately. If I think of it, I'll yell it out. But he did a whole heap of research on people doing studying both university courses, online courses, secondary education, and he came up with these tips as being really useful for consolidating information. So I won't go through all of them now. I'll let you go through those in your own time because obviously we want to get on to the content. The main one I think I would draw your attention to now though is familiarity. Beware of that. So just because you are familiar with something or have seen it before doesn't mean you really know it. So the emphasis there is, you might go, oh yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with that, that's great. But if you want to really know about it, you still have to repeat, and go through those other tips to ensure that you get it stuck right in your head. All right, so on the content, what are we going to talk about this evening? So security basics. We're going to talk about goals of information security, the primary goals of information security, and how they fit together, how they relate together. Some security basic principles and terminology, some security roles, policies, awareness, access control models and strategies as well, okay, which fit into that roles and policies and awareness. So security basics. Now, why that? I chose that picture just because I thought it was humorous. That someone would have their laptop inside their jumper. Quite effective, not necessarily healthy for you, but effective in keeping prying eyes away. All right, so understanding network security, what do we need to understand about that? Firstly, a little bit of a definition. So that network security, really what we're talking about there is mechanisms or technologies or policies or processes by which the network information assets are protected. So network information assets could be information. It could also pertain to hardware devices, specific hardware devices, or any aspect of your online environment that anyone can access at any time from anywhere. So that's not to say it's always accessible from anywhere, but it could be talking about a context from people accessing internally, externally, from within your building, from the next suburb, from the next town, from the next country, so on and so forth. So any mechanisms which we use to protect that online information is what network security is for the purposes of this particular online course. In terms of the primary goals of network security or cyber security, there are three big things that we need to protect. And these guys are known, hopefully you will have heard of it, the CIA triangle. Okay, so that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So our primary goals of security is to protect confidentiality, that is, only allow access to resources to people who have the right to those resources. So confidential information must remain confidential. Secret information must remain secret. Maintain integrity is about making sure that documents are not changed in an unauthorized way or an accidental way. Okay, so we have to make sure that our information stays the same as it should be in its purest form. And then lastly, to assure availability. So that means that people who need access to information will get access to the information when they need it. Okay, so and a typical one that we always talk about there is denial of service attacks are the big one that most people know about that impacts on that availability. And we'll have a look at examples next week of attacks on all these particular primary goals. So as we step through each week, what I want you to do is think about the concepts that we talk about and apply them back to these three primary goals. So if I talk about a specific mechanism, so a firewall or an IDS or encryption or a security awareness program or an appropriate internet usage policy, think about how that applies, that particular mechanism or a control applies to one of these primary goals. Right? Because it always needs, any useful mechanism has to apply back to one of these goals. If it's not protecting one of these primary goals, then it's probably not worth having.
Sorry, Matt, I'll just jump in.
Sure.
Got some questions about terminology. Would you use network security and cybersecurity interchangeably?
Yeah, it could be. Yep.
And Bill's asking, is there a difference between network security, information security, and cybersecurity?
Not particularly, not for the purposes of this particular online course. Network security, I guess, if you're talking real specifics, network security is going to apply more to LAN, WAN type security. So looking at firewalls, IDS, router access lists, switch, port protection, port security, all those sorts of really specific technical things. For the purposes of the online course, you can think of network security as just being the same as cyber security, the same as information security. So we're looking at it, if you like, from 1,000 foot up, looking at the big picture, how do we protect our information resources? And of course, in the vast majority of cases, those information resources are online, and in order to be able to provide them online, there needs to be some network envelope or network bubble around it. So if you think of it in that way.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so now the interesting thing about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, is that there's also the opposite to that. That's DAD, so disclosure, alteration, and denial. And it's important that we understand that those terms, how those terms work together. So disclosure of information is clearly the opposite of confidentiality. Alteration, whether it's accidental or deliberate, is the opposite of keeping things, keeping the integrity of your particular information. And denial is the opposite of availability. So it's important that you understand that for every side of the triangle, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, there is also a opposite to that which relates to it as well. And that just, hopefully that'll help to make that CIA a little bit clearer. So Earl, I'll just answer that question there. When you say availability is a primary goal, you don't mean disaster recovery also, do you? Yes, disaster recovery is part of availability, does impact on availability, and we'll see about that in week 4. We talk about disaster recovery and business continuity planning out there. Okay, so network security, cyber security, information security has a number of different tasks, okay, that we need to, so expanding on the CIA DAD. Security should ensure that users, 1, perform only tasks they are authorized to do. Okay, so that's the confidentiality part of it. Obtain only information they are authorized to have, also confidentiality. Sorry, the first one's also integrity as well. Cannot cause damage to data applications or operating system, again, integrity, and also bleeding a little bit into availability for others. And data exchanges are conducted in a secure and safe manner. Again, that availability, confidentiality type task. So, threats. What are the threats to our network security, cyber security, information security? Lots. As you can see, this graphic is showing you some of the types of things that can upset the apple cart in terms of our security. So clearly that's not exhaustive, but there's an awful lot there, and quite a lot of those we'll be dealing with over the next 4 weeks. So typically we talk about different causes of threats, or different things that provide a vulnerability or a pathway to an attack vector, if you like. And typically we like to categorize them into 4 different things. So technology weaknesses, configuration weaknesses, policy weaknesses, and then lastly, human error. Now you'll find that there are times when some things will overlap. Some types of configuration issues or issues will overlap with technology, maybe configurations issues that are specific to certain types of technology. And we'll see some overlap there as we go through some examples shortly. But they're the 4 basic categories that we're going to deal with in the next 4 weeks. That's not to say this is the only way of categorizing things. You'll see, particularly when we start talking about IDS or intrusion detection systems, when we start talking about those, there's a number of different ways that you can categorize things. So keep in mind, this is 4 categorizations of things that can cause threats. It is not the only categorization, but it's the one we're going to use for this particular course. So technology weaknesses, what are we talking about there? So some examples of technology weaknesses. For example, TCP/IP has some weaknesses that are part of the standard. It's an open protocol. In other words, it's developed by a standards committee, been around for a long time. It was developed to survive, but not necessarily to be secure. When it first was developed way back in the 70s, I think late 60s, early 70s, the size of online environments really didn't exist, certainly not to the scale and magnitude that they do now. And so those thoughts about security and reaching into the future just didn't occur. And so a lot of these older protocols, which there's many of them that are still in use today, were developed to provide a certain service, but not necessarily with security in mind. Whereas if we look at, say, IPv6 now, IPv6 has a number of secure technology mechanisms built into it directly. So there's more of a emphasis on security with IPv6, for instance, than there was with IPv4. And there's a number of, SNMP is another one as well, System Network Management Protocol, where version 1 and 2, no security concept, understanding, care. Version 3, we start to bring in the security, basic encryption, if you want to call it, password protection, those sorts of things. Same sort of thing with routing protocols. Some routing protocols now, a number of routing protocols will allow you to do authentication of neighbors. Some send in encrypted form, whereas way back when, that certainly wasn't the case. So these things have certainly developed over time as online environments have become bigger, more open to anyone, and certainly carrying information that 20, 30 years ago was never even thought of. So operating systems are another example. Millions of lines of codes, lots of bugs, lots of exploits, inherently insecure. Now we know that. We know there's lots of problems with Windows operating system, for example. And it stands to reason, given how many millions of lines of code there is, how quickly they try to get things to market, to get features out there that people want. Inevitably, there's going to be holes introduced, there's going to be coding errors, there's going to be problems. It's just the nature of the beast. It's so complex and so big now compared to what it was 20 years ago, that there's always going to be issues with operating systems. So that's categorized as a technology weakness. And then we've got our network equipment as another example. So default installation or default configurations. Say, for instance, a Cisco switch, VLAN 1 as a management VLAN is the default. VTP or VTP, they've changed that, used to be in server mode, now in client mode, so that VLANs could override each other. Default passwords, all those sorts of things. Okay, if people aren't are skilled enough to be able to run up their new Cisco switch appropriately and securely, you can effectively get one out of the box, plug it into your network, and it'll work. It will work as a switch. Won't necessarily be secure or manageable, but it will work as a switch. And certainly in some environments that definitely happens. In terms of configuration weaknesses, there's lots of them, and there are some examples there, some of which we will go through in more detail as we go along. Lots of different configuration weaknesses, some of them like Trojan horse programs. So the reason that's there is because it can be caused, it can be allowed, permitted because of a configuration weakness. It can also, once it's loaded, create a configuration weakness as well. Okay, same with viruses. So it can be either side of the coin, not necessarily it is a configuration weakness. It could be permitted by a configuration weakness, or it could cause a configuration weakness somewhere else down the line. A recent example that I just wanted to quickly talk about was this one from, well, it's a little while back now. The Australian military system, it doesn't say who it is, but it was a contractor that had some confidential information. And it was hacked, if you like, or gain access to. And basically, long story short, you can certainly read the link if you want to, and you can get it in a PowerPoint slides to go off to. But basically, at the end of the day, what they did was this particular contract had a web portal where the admin password was admin and the guest user password was guest. So to cut a long story short, that made it really easy to knock down the front door. So just some sloppy admin administration, sloppy configuration from the owners of the contractor, and there was some information that, you know, about the F-35 Joint Strike Force fighter that went out, but allegedly it wasn't important. It was just it was confidential, but it wasn't classified, as they say. So that's one particular example, and you would have heard, I'm sure, of many of them, and you guys will have many of them as well. You'll know about that have happened in recent times. And then we have policy weaknesses. Now, these are ones that are often overlooked because policies, let's face it, no one likes writing policies, no one likes reading policies. But they're really important. Security policies are absolutely vital in the overall context of the big picture of security. Some examples of policy weaknesses are simply lack of a written security policy or specific security policies. So that might be to do with appropriate internet access or email access or whatever sort of systems you have inside your system, inside your network. Politics can cause issues with policy weaknesses. Arguments between different departments, managers fighting turf wars to try and get the upper hand, so to speak. High turnover in staff is also another one. The higher turnover in staff, the less likely it is that a consistent security approach will be taken. Concise access controls not applied, again, as a policy weakness. And this is because this is basically underpinned by the fact that there is no policy, might not be any policy, and so those access controls never get applied correctly and uniformly. Software and hardware installation and changes that don't follow policy. So no change management, no standard build, no baselining. Those sorts of things can lead to weaknesses in other areas. So there's a bit of an overlap between configuration and technology weaknesses there, but that's caused by the underlying lack of policy. And certainly a non-existent disaster recovery plan is a real big policy weakness. And again, that's something that we talk about in a lot more detail in week 4. And then human error, which we are never going to eradicate. No matter what anyone says, we're not going to eradicate it. So we've got accident, might be ignorance, so just don't know how to do something, unaware of a particular policy or process. Workload, so working way too hard, under the pump, burnt out, tired. Let's face it, we all are in the IT industry, aren't we? IT industry is a churn and burn industry in a lot of ways. Dishonesty, certainly one. There's always going to be people that do the wrong thing. Impersonation or social engineering, which we have a look at, we discuss in more detail a bit later on, and angry employees, disgruntled employees, all can contribute to human error type issues. So then if we move on to, okay, that's fine, we know about these technology weaknesses, the policy weaknesses, the configuration weaknesses, and the human errors. We now know what information cyber network security is. How do we create, or what do we need to consider to create a secure network strategy that protects our information assets? We need to, broadly speaking, address both internal and external threats. Internal threats, probably more than you're currently doing. And that's because of that implicit trust that internal users have. And we'll talk about that more as we go along. We need to define policies and procedures. So we need to get rid of, as much as we can, those policy weaknesses. They're really important, really important, because they underpin everything else that we do from a technological aspect. And try to reduce risk across perimeter security. Now, the whole concept of perimeter is really interesting now because it's changed. It has changed drastically over the last few years. So the perimeter, when I said perimeter, security perimeter, years ago, most people would think of that as being the boundary between the internal network and the internet, for example. And that certainly is part of the perimeter. But a perimeter now is very fluid. It can be anywhere within your network. It can exist around any specific entity. So for example, you may have a perimeter around your HR portion of your network. Okay, that's still a perimeter. It's protecting your HR resources from everyone, both external and internal. Okay, so don't just think of the perimeter as being that hard layer protecting us from the internet. Okay, a perimeter can exist anywhere, can be fluid, and it can change depending on what we do with our network. You think if we get some, as we add extra service, for instance, or extra applications, or we bring on extranet partners, or we absorb another organization and bring them into our network, this changes the perimeter. So the perimeter is moving, fluid, it's a real live living beast. It can be a little bit difficult to get your head around at times. We need to also consider human factors. So the human factors we talked about before, the human weaknesses. We need to know your weaknesses. Now, how do we do that? We do that by baselining. Two primary tools that we use are baselining. So understanding what your base expectation is for your network, what your base performance, what your base traffic, what your base access level is. Because if you don't know what that base level is, it's almost impossible to know when something unusual happens. So you have to have a starting point to enable you to understand what is abnormal. The other tool we use is vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. So we look for weaknesses in our system passively using online tools. And sometimes they can be social engineering and those sorts of things as well. So we do port scans, we do ping sweeps, and we look at responses. We see what services are open on certain devices, how far, what's got a web service running, what's got an FTP service running, there's an email server over there, there's a DNS server over there, so on and so forth. So we look around our network and determine what software systems and software ports we have available. Once we know that, we can then go further and do our penetration testing to see how far we can exploit those particular services to get inside the network and elevate our privilege. Because at the end of the day, that's usually the ultimate aim of an attacker, is to try to elevate privileges so they can get access to whatever they want. So we need to know what those weaknesses are so we can prevent them. We can put in mitigation techniques which stop them from being penetrated, or stop them from being used against us. We need to achieve security through persistence. So that is, security is, it's a development life cycle. It's a never-ending thing. What a security hole we patch today, another one will open up tomorrow. We install a different patch, we install a different operating system, we upgrade our bespoke application. Something is introduced, therefore we have another security hole we need to change. We go to a different firewall vendor. We change switch iOS or router iOS. We add a different routing protocol in. We upgrade to a different database system. All those things, all those operations can potentially bring in security holes. And this is where knowing your baseline and your vulnerability scanning and penetration testing are really valuable tools in being able to determine what's going on in your network. Physical security is also something that people often overlook. So they have all this great data security or logical digital security, but you can go up and you can open up the cabinet door on their file server and press the power button. And there's availability, bang, gone. Okay, so physical security is also really, really important. And again, we talk about that more, I think in week 3, we talk about that a lot more. And then perimeter security, as I said before. So this is fluid. This changes, this up and down. Next step is to briefly talk about authentication models. So, and the reason we're talking about this now is because we're going to have a look at access control models in a minute, where this sort of fits in with. So there's a bit of an introduction to that. So single and multi-factor authentication. So single factor authentication is use of a single credential. So it's a username or a password or a passphrase or a swipe card. Whatever it is, it's one thing. Two-factor authentication is using 2 different credentials. So it might be a username and password. It could be a username and a swipe tag. It could be a physical key and a swipe tag. It could be an ID badge and a swipe tag. Lots of different examples of what that can be. And then three-factor authentication is using 3 different credentials. So you can see there's a bit of a theme going on here. The more factors we use, the more secure it is going to be. The harder it's going to be to try and penetrate or break. So there's some authentication factors there. So something you know, something you have, something you are, somewhere you are, something you do. These are all different phrases that we use in authentication factors. So something you know is a password or a passphrase or a PIN. Something you have can be a token or a swipe card or a key. Something you are is based on biometrics, so our retina scans, our palm scans, our weight, all those sorts of things. Somewhere you are, so it could be coming in via GPS location, an IP subnet, a VLAN, for example. Something you do, some sort of habitual behavior. So every week at this time, I go and do this particular security thing. So security guard may know you. They know that you're coming in at this time every week to change the backup tape. Something like that. It's habitual behavior. If anything changes outside of that, then that gets noticed, hopefully. Multi-factor is stronger, so 2 and 3 factor are common, but the more factors you use, the more difficult it is to break. Biometrics are generally the strongest, simply because they are often unique to you as an individual. So a retina, palm scan, fingerprint, completely unique. And despite what you see in the movies, they're not necessarily as easy to obfuscate as, or bypass, for want of a better word, as what the movies make out. So single sign-on authentication is also important, just to briefly have a look at. So basically we're talking about identity management or federated identity management. So just really single sign-on is really just the ability in a system to log in one spot and have access to everything you need. More or less, and that's probably as much as we really need to talk about that at the moment. We look at it more in detail in the subsequent weeks. Now, before I go on to the access control methodologies, I might just scroll through some of these questions that are here.
Yeah, they're going gangbusters.
Yep, which is good.
I'll try and get
okay, so Shannon, the question about access control strategies, I'll show you that we're going to talk about that very shortly. What is it? Okay, Windows, Linux. No, we don't talk specifically about Windows or Linux servers, Craig. CIA, DoD, Triangle, and how it applies to group policy. Well, think about what is the role of group policy? What does it do? Think about that, and it should give you your answer. Confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So I'll let you ponder on that, and we'll come back to it. Authentication, authorization, and accounting. How does it fit into CIA, DoD? Again, think about what they are. Authentication. Okay, availability lines up with availability. Authorization lines up with availability and potentially integrity as well. Accounting is less aligned with those specifically, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but it keeps track of what people are getting access to. So again, you will find patching technology weakness can be, yes. So Hannah, no, coverage of ISM and ASD, not specifically, no. It'll be, we might mention it briefly at different times, but no, not go into it in any depth. Network and application security, well, if we talk about those specific differences, as I said before, network security is more around routers, switches, firewalls, IDS. Application security would be around specific applications. So your web browser, your web servers, your DNS, your SQL servers, your bespoke applications, anything like that, any applications that you're actually using to provide services. So the principles are exactly the same. principles are exactly the same. It still goes back to the concepts of CI and A as the primary goals, but they're just, the mechanisms that you use are different because the implementation is different. Hardware issues, yep. Technology issues, I would classify as technology issues. Custom apps and programs is a major weakness. It is, but you could probably, you could probably put them, and this is what I said before, some of them overlap, Earl, so you could put them into configuration or technology as well, either one of those. Cyber diplomacy may fall under policy weakness. That's a really good question. Cyber diplomacy could be considered a policy weakness in some cases. Yep, excellent. Really, really good question. Just see, there's a couple that are coming up. So no demonstrations this week. Craig. So Harry, possible to hide opening ports from port scanners like Nmap? Yes, it is. We'll look at that a little bit in detail next week. Photographs used for authentication, they can be, yes. Single sign-on could be considered a vulnerability, absolutely. Yep, if you get access to one spot, you've got access to everything, so it could be considered a vulnerability. That's why it's really important to ensure you have a good, robust SSO, single sign-on. Biometric data considered a one-factor authentication. Would be if you use it on your own. Yeah, it's more about the classification of how many of those factors you use together. So if you only use that on its own, it would be one-factor authentication, absolutely, but still pretty strong.
There's a couple of questions on biometrics a little bit further down, Matt.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Why would you consider it as strongest? There's maybe issues with biometrics like jelly baby, fake fingerprints, fake scan responding, and then there's another question further down about if someone steals your biometrics, maybe your fingerprint.
As I said before, that's a lot of that stuff is stuff in the movies. It's not really as easy as what it comes across as, but absolutely there is a possibility that all of that can certainly happen. The reason I say it's the strongest is because it's unique. So a fingerprint is unique. So no one else has that same fingerprint. So if you just look at it from that particular basic principle point of view, a fingerprint is unique, therefore it's going to be stronger than a password or a username or anything else, which can be easily guessable. You can't easily guess or duplicate a fingerprint. So yeah, that's why it's the strongest. Brad, I just saw that last question, Apple Face ID. I haven't used it, to be honest, not an expert on that. I guess in theory, it's really good. Implementation, certainly been problems with it, but in theory, yeah, why not? All right, I might just leave a few of the other questions because the more I answer, the more that are coming in. So we might just continue on with the access control methodologies for now and then come back to the questions a little bit later on.
Beauty, thanks, mate.
Okay, so access control methodologies or models. So what is access control? A basic definition is the process by which resources or services are granted or denied on a computer system or network. Okay, nice simple definition. There are 4 control models or methodologies that we're going to look at. But first, some terminology. So identification is basically, the way we're going to use it is, it's a user accessing a computer system would have to present credentials or identification such as a username or potentially one of those biometrics or something to identify that it is them. It could even be a swiper or any sort of thing that uniquely identifies them. Authentication is then the checking of those credentials to be sure that they're firstly authentic, so not made up, but also that they are valid for that particular system. And then the authorization is the granting of permission to take action or to access a certain resource or information based on the security policy set up within that system. And that's tied directly back to the identification and the authentication. So access control, as a big picture, is accomplished generally in one of three ways. So through the use of hardware, software, or policy type mechanisms, and most often in a combination of those. And we'll look at that as we go along more. It can take different forms. So access control can take different forms depending on what is being protected. Okay, so whether it's a physical resource or a digital resource in particular, and the relative value of that particular resource. Other terminology which we use to describe our computer systems impose, access controller, object, subject, and operation. So object is the focus of the access. So what is it you're trying to access? The subject is the entity trying to access that object. And that subject might be a device, so it could be another computer system, or it could be an individual person or individual group. And then the operation clearly is what they're trying to do to that particular object. Okay, an access control model, if we take that definition of access control slightly further, is a predefined framework that hardware and software developers use in order to implement access control on their devices or their applications that they're developing. So if you almost think like it's almost like an OSI type, like the OSI model is a basis for the development of communication. An access control model is a basis for implementing access control. Once that access control model is applied, custodians or people who own information or own systems configure security based on, custodians are the configurers, configure security based on the parameters set down by the owners. So the owner and the custodian can be one and the same, or they can be separate entities or separate people. Those security parameters that we're talking about are basically as set by policy. Okay, so you can think of it as being like a firewall rule base or some sort of treatment plan for particular access or traffic, or you can think of it as an actual written down policy. Either way, it's the same. It documents how we want to treat information and users interacting together given a certain context. At the end of the day, an access control model, the goal is to enable end users to do the job that they need to do without letting them go further than they should. So, number one, first access control model, mandatory access control. And we'll have a look at a summary slide of this in a moment, which is really important heading into exam week. So in mandatory access control, the end user, so the person that gets to look at things, cannot implement, modify, or transfer any of the security controls. Okay, they can't do anything. They can only access what they have been given rights to access, but they can't change any of that access restriction. The owner and custodian, who, as I said before, can be one and the same or can be different, are responsible for managing those access controls. It is the most restrictive model because of the fact that the end user can't change anything. In the original mandatory access control model, all objects, so everything we're trying to protect, all resources, and subjects, so people who are trying to access those resources, were assigned a numeric access level. And the access level of the subject, so the person wanting to access something, had to be higher than that of the resource that they were trying to be accessing. If it wasn't, they couldn't get access to it. So it was in the old days. It was the way it was initially implemented, just based on numeric access levels. We then have discretionary access control, which is the direct opposite. It's the least restrictive. So a user or subject has total control over everything, along with the programs that are associated with those objects. Okay, so you think about specific, say specific documents, Word documents, for example. In discretionary access control, the users have complete access to those, as does the application to those particular documents. In this particular model, the subject can also, the user can also change the permissions for other users over those resources. So it's completely open slather. Because of that, it has two significant weaknesses. One is that it relies on the end user to have the ability or the knowledge to set the correct security parameters based on the information they're trying to protect. And also a subject's permissions will be inherited by any programs that the subject executes. Okay, so if you're logged in as user A, any application you execute will also have the same access to the resources that you're accessing as you do. Okay, now the two trickier ones, because they have names that sound very similar. So there's role-based access control, and this is sometimes called non-discretionary access control, but we won't call it that. That's just for comparison. Most of the time, or rest of the time, we're going to call it role-based access control. And this is basically considered the real-world approach, and is one that is implemented in many places. And you'll see when we read the last two statements here, it will hopefully ring bells for all of you. In the role-based access control model, we assign permissions to particular roles or job functions within an organization, and then we assign users to that particular job role or function. The objects or resources we're trying to protect are set to be a certain type, and subjects or users with that particular role or job function have access. So that's like our typical security we use in Windows environments, in Novell environments, in Unix environments. So we basically have user accounts assigned to groups. The groups are assigned to resources, and away we go. And what's really good about that is that scalability, in that we can change access for a group and automatically change access for all those users, rather than having to go back and assign access to every single user, or worse, to every single resource. And then the last one is the rule-based access control, also called rule-based role-based, which is even more confusing. I shall henceforth only refer to it as rule-based. In this model, we dynamically assign roles to subjects based on a set of rules which are defined by the custodian or owner of the resource that we're trying to get access to. Each resource object or each resource contains a set of access properties which are also set or defined based on those particular rules. Rule-based access control is often used for managing user access to one or more systems. So this is typically used in single sign-on systems. Okay, so where you get dynamic access to a secondary system based on your access to a primary system, or based on an associated policy. Again, a little bit trickier, this one, but certainly the role-based access control is what you're going to see more of. And there's a nice little summary slide, which gives you the basics of each one of those models, and is probably really useful for you to get your head around quite strongly. So there's nothing on that slide that we haven't already spoken about, but take some time to actually go through that. Now, the access control strategies, which there was a question about earlier. So there's 4 access control strategies that we typically talk about. Doesn't mean they're the only ones. These are ones that we're going to talk about. So there is separation of duties. So these are, so models are a framework for implementing access control. Control strategies are ways in which we can further take our security. So separation of duties is the first one. So this is where we have multiple individuals basically doing the same job. Okay, so we separate things. Okay, so one person will do part of the job, someone else will do another part of the job. Collusion can be an issue with separation of duties, but it depends on how many people you have doing these particular roles. But But so basically, if the fraudulent application of a process potentially results in a breach of security, so in other words, if people are playing the bad game on a particular resource, and that's going to result in a major breach of security, then we should divide that particular process between multiple individuals to reduce the chance of that happening. It's not to say it's going to eradicate it, because we can always have collusion, but it will certainly lessen the chance of that happening. The second one is job rotation. So instead of one person having total responsibility for a function, individuals are periodically moved from one job to another. So that's different from separation of duties. Might sound similar, but it's different. So job rotation means that I might sit and do this job, for example, job A for 6 weeks, and then I go off and do a totally separate job for another 6 weeks, and I might rotate around 5 or 6 jobs and then come back to the original one. Now, the reason that's good as a security strategy is that within that 6-week period, or however long it may be, it might not be 6 weeks, it might be a week, it might be a month, it might be a year, whatever the case may be, I have responsibility for that role, but then I have to pass it on to someone else. So if I'm doing anything nefarious, it's potentially going to be noticed or become obvious. Again, collusion can be an issue, but the more jobs, the more people you have rotating through those jobs, again, the less likely that is to actually happen. The principle of least privilege, which is a really simple one, it's just basically that you only get the minimal amount of privileges necessary to do your job. That's it. So if you've got job A, job B, and job C, you will get specific access for each of those jobs that is limited to exactly what you need for that particular job. So you're never going to get any more than that. There's no escalation of privileges. So you only get what you absolutely must need. And that can be a problem. This is a difficult one to retrofit. Lots of times I've been involved in doing these sorts of things, retrofitting security, and people are so used to be able to do everything that when you suddenly start to put limitations on them, it becomes very difficult politically. Lots of angry users, absolutely. And then the last one is implicit deny. So implicit deny is a real simple one, sits at the bottom of access lists, if you like, firewall rule bases in a lot of places. The basic idea is if a certain set of criteria or a condition is not explicitly met, then you just can't have access. Go away, that's it, you're just rejected. So it's very granular, can be very specific. Then on top of all this, on top of all these lovely technical and logical controls that we have and policies and everything else, we then have this lovely thing called awareness, which is heavily related to probably my favorite security breach potential, and that's social engineering, which in the end is really just clever manipulation of our tendency as humans to want to trust others and want to be popular with others and want to please others. And this happens so often, you know, basically leading someone on, leading them down the garden path and getting the information that you need off them. Very easy to do, very interesting topic, which unfortunately we don't talk about in a huge amount. We do mention bits and pieces of it, but really interesting. So, but the reason I'm sort of bringing up here is because it relates to this whole security awareness platform. So security awareness has got to envelop, if you like, everyone within your organization. So it's all right for us as security professionals to have an awareness of security and what it means and where the weaknesses are and what sort of things can happen. But it's really important for our end users and our front of house staff and our general rank and file staff to understand the concepts of security and the ways in which it can be negated or affected. So there are many different ways to build security awareness within an organization. And I'm not going to sit here and sprout which is the best way to go, because which is the best way to go is going to depend on your organization, your culture, your type of business, your day-to-day processing, your day-to-day customers, your day-to-day interactions with external parties. It's all going to be driven by that. And actually that is something you'll hear me say a lot in the next 4 weeks is it depends. The answer to a lot of questions is it depends. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. It depends on what you're trying to protect. Okay, sometimes there is no specific best answer. Sometimes there is, often there isn't. There's many ways to skin a cat, as the saying goes. Awareness, however, should be a part of all induction programs, but typically is not. Okay, normally you'll go to an induction program, you'll find out all about health and safety, and you'll find out where the toilets are and who you need to talk to if you've got a complaint and what your general day-to-day operating procedures are, but often they don't talk about security awareness. So the important thing to get from this particular slide, more than the actual specific roles that are mentioned there or specific accountabilities, is that security awareness really is everyone's responsibility. Okay, it's not just the role of management, not just the role of specialized roles, so IT security people, network security people, the guys that answer the phone in the contact center, whoever else you can think of, the cleaner, whatever. It's everyone. Everyone has a responsibility to recognize threats, to understand that security is beneficial and helps them protect their organization. If you protect the organization, you're protecting your own job in a lot of ways. It's everyone's responsibility to report potential security issues, as it is to report any health hazards. And it's about making security a habit. Healthy work practices, safe work practices are really pushed because it goes against human life. Security habits need to be pushed as well. They need to be front and center. And if that means putting up security awareness posters everywhere, writing specific security awareness policies, doing specific security awareness training, then that's what you need to do for your organization. But at the end of the day, the main point of that slide is it is everyone's role. Some people have specific accountabilities, like specialized staff or management have specific accountabilities that they have to do. But at the end of the day, it's everyone's responsibility to ensure that security is maintained, whatever that be, whether it be physical security, digital security, logical security, whatever. And this slide here, basically what this one is saying is that the minimum security awareness, as we go up the tree into specialized roles, the security awareness becomes more, as does the increasing level of risk. So the more in-depthly involved you are with the technicalities of a system or the responsibility of a system, the higher the level of risk you have to understand and deal with. Okay, and that's what really this slide is saying about. The higher up the technical tree you get, the bigger understanding or the bigger investment, either logically or technically, that you have in a specific system or a specific network or a specific information resource, the greater the level of risk associated with that and the more you have to deal with it. But again, at the end of the day, all personnel have to have a general security awareness. Management decision makers and some specialized roles have to have a better understanding of security and how it fits within the overall organization. And then of course, then you have your IT security people, your technical specialists, your experts that will know more about that as well and understand the level of risk better and be able to deal with those risks as they come up. So a security awareness program should have what, or should be about what? Lots of different things. Okay, and again, this is probably not exhaustive. There's probably other things that you may do in your organization that you would be able to bring to the table as well. But basically, we need to identify compliance or audit standards that your organization must adhere to. So we have to have compliance and audit standards written. They have to be passed around and people have to be aware of them and be willing to enforce them. That's part of security awareness. So second statement, corollary of the first. Identify organizational goals, risks, and security policy. They need to be identified. If they're not identified, people can't be informed about them and they can't understand them. You need to identify stakeholders and get their support. So who is that? That's management, other users, other technical staff, customers, partners, lots of different people potentially. You need a baseline of the organization's security awareness. So again, as I talked about technical baselines earlier, you need to have an understanding of where you are in order to be able to improve it, in order to be able to get better. We need a project charter, or you can create, don't have to have one, but you can create a project charter to establish the scope for security awareness training programs. You should have security awareness training programs, okay? Unless your, your responsibility or your business is strictly limited to a very select task, where you may not need security awareness training. In general businesses, general enterprise, general networks, you need to have that security awareness training for everyone. So more importantly for the rank and file, because typically as you get higher up the technical ladder and understanding of security concepts, you have that inherent awareness already built in, so to speak. Potentially a steering committee to help with the awareness program, identify who you're going to be targeting, employees, IT personnel, developers, senior leadership, they're all going to need different levels of awareness training based on where they sit in that tree. And then identify what you're going to communicate to those groups. Okay, so the goal is to have shortest possible training period with the greatest impact. So succinct, direct, to the point, get it out there, get the understanding happening, evolve it as things change within your network. And then identify how you're going to communicate that content. Okay, is it going to be online? Is it going to be face-to-face? Is it going to be practical assessments involved? How are you going to do it? Is there any penalties, if you like, or sanctions if you don't adhere to the security awareness training that you've been given? And think about how often we'll run it. Do we only run it for new employees? Do we run it annually? Do we run it ongoing? So every month, every fortnight, have a meeting, discuss security awareness. Lots of different things to consider. Get the tools and resources you need to get it operating. So again, that comes down to having support from the stakeholders and the management to be able to give you the tools and resources to enable that security awareness program to take off. Think about how you're going to evaluate its success. So are you going to evaluate it by saying, all right, well, we have a reduction of 10% of security incidences in the last 3 months. That shows our awareness is greater. Is it just, you're just going to do it ad hoc, going around talking to people, looking at their desks? Are they cleaning up their desks? Do they have sticky post-it notes everywhere with confidential information on it? There's lots of different ways of evaluating it. How you evaluate it is going to depend on the culture and the processes involved within your own organization. Who do you communicate with and engage? Again, spoke about that briefly on the last page. Who needs the training? How much training do they need? When are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? Implement training options to cover the different learning styles. Now we talk about the different learning styles, okay? Some people like to read, some people like to listen, some people like to do, some people like to write. Lots of different ways you can learn. Generally, I think, we learn using multiple different ways. We may have a preference, but we use all of those different options. And then track employee progress feeds back into that evaluated success. How are we going to evaluate success? We need to review our program at least annually because things change in our organization, yes? Our networks don't stay the same from one year to another. Things change, applications change, staff turnover, technologies change, lots of different things, information changes, value of information changes. So we need to keep reviewing our security awareness to keep pace with that. New and changing threats, again, as we implement new technologies, again, threats can change. Evaluate the implementation. So again, harking back to the previous point on the last page, how do we evaluate? How do we know whether it's working or not? We can ask for employee feedback on it as well to determine whether they like it. Are they enjoying it? Do they feel like they're getting any benefit from it? Do they think that things are improving? That's all very important, as it is to ask from really not just the underling employees, but any level, all the stakeholders. And keep management engaged and on side, clearly. If management aren't on side with it, it's going to fail point blank. Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to look at some more details around attacks and threats. So these particular ones here, network, password, application, human attacks. So again, apply them to the categories that we've talked about tonight in some respect with some overlap, and look at some ways and methods and methodologies for identifying threats and how we come to know that things are even going wrong in our particular environment. All right, so with that, questions. Wow.
A lazy million.
Yeah, as I'd expect from a cohort of 382. So let's see what we've got.
Well, I'll start with one that just follows straight off the back of that last slide. And also pump up your tires a bit. So a question from Craig. Matt, this is brilliant. I completely adhere to your points. However, it only takes one uninterested manager and the whole thing falls apart as soon as they say it's a waste of time. Do you have any tactics that would help with this? Just a general people management
Look,
question.
yeah, 100% right, Craig. 100% right. You only need one person, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a manager. You could have one other technical person in your particular department that doesn't agree with it, and it can all fall to pieces pretty quickly. I guess in terms of relating that back to a manager, it's difficult, but it's about trying to cultivate. And again, this is getting off really security stuff. It's getting more towards a psychology, organizational psychology, which amazingly I also have qualifications in, but you need to try to almost upwardly manage if you can. You need to build a relationship, build some trust with that particular person, and hopefully be able to sell it to them. But I mean, it's a great question, and look, I haven't got a specific answer for it, to be honest, other than to say, keep that relationship building, try to do that upward managing, and try to sell it to them the best you can in any way that you can, because security awareness programs are very, very important. Fantastic question though, Craig.
And we've had some responses from other students. Marcus saying make security a legal requirement to force management to go down that path. And
yeah, that can be difficult. There are some organisations that will have legislative requirements, and if that's the case, then yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And if you can also get upper management to write it into a policy document, then that's above that level of manager who's going to say, no, I don't like it, then that's great. But if it goes all the way to the top, it can be difficult.
And an excellent point from Stephen as well. In the past, he's had to use risk quantification to show the money that can be saved, sort of the prevention rather than the
absolutely. That's a fantastic point. And once you start getting down to dollars and cents savings, that's often a really good way to sway it.
And because there's so many questions, Matt, I've just marked a few as someone that will answer live. Maybe if you just want to go through about 10 of those, there's about 10 of those, okay. and the rest.
Okay. Yep.
It's not so much a reflection of the question. It's just I had to choose 10. And this is where the forums come in. So between now and next week, these are all great questions just to discuss in the forum on top of the sort of set prompts. And this is where the real value in these short courses comes. I think everyone's sort of throwing ideas around, and then people with different experiences coming in and saying, hey, have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? As we just had with the question from Craig. So absolutely. So chuck the questions in the forum and we'll see what comes out of it.
All right, so good question from Steve. Biometrics, once compromised, can't be changed, unlike codes and passwords. What happens next? Certainly if you don't know that your biometrics have been compromised, absolutely you can't change them. But if you do know your biometric has been compromised, then absolutely you can change it. You can unenroll, if you like, that particular biometric process from your authentication and change it to something else. If you're only using biometrics, obviously that would be difficult, but seldom do people only use biometrics. So certainly it can be changed or can be unenrolled. Obviously, if your fingerprint is compromised, your particular fingerprint, I mean, you've got 9 others that you could potentially use, or technically 8 others and 2 thumbprints. But you're right in what you say. If a particular palm scan or retina scan is compromised, then it is difficult to change it, or there's limitations. So you would need to use that in conjunction with other authentication methods as well. With the advancement and development of AI, how much focus is there on the moment network security to combat, defend against it? That's really a discussion for numerous vendors, but I think you'll find there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than what we know about. Certainly I know of a few projects. Actually, that's a good point. I might put some of that. There's some project information I can put up that is focused on AI. To combat, defend against it. But that's a huge talking point. In fact, I was reading a newspaper article the other day about artificial intelligence and robotics and the threats to all sorts of things that represents. So that's a huge conversation, and one that's going to be really difficult to combat in the future. I guess it's one of those things where humans often tend to outsmart themselves, and that might be one of the technological tangents that we're going on that may result in that happening to devastating effect. But that's if you want to be a naysayer about it, I suppose. So that's certainly something to look at for in the future.
As Aaron says in the chat, I for one welcome our new robot overlords.
Yes. Yeah. Wow, we could talk about that all night, I'm sure. So Craig has asked, can I ask if a subject is always a person and if an object is always some software or application in cyber? No, a subject is not always a person. It can be another system. So basically the subject, if you think of an object as being a resource and a subject being the entity that wants to access that resource. Simple as that. So it could be a person, is often a person, but it could be another system. Certainly it doesn't have to be those specific definitions. Active Directory be considered a role-based access control model? It is considered a implementation of a role-based access control model as well, but there are also ways in which you can use Active Directory to be a rule-based as well. But yeah, you could definitely consider it as role-based access control for sure. Okay, so which access control model does a Unix style sticky bit where you set access control to an executable for a logged on user, and if they have access to execute the program, then the program is run with super user root access. That is almost, well, that sort of fits into the rule-based, role-based access control category. So it's not, it also fits into, can also, depending on the way you do it, if you sign it via groups or individual users, can also be considered role-based as well. Could also be considered, well, depending on how you do it, could also be considered mandatory access control as well, if you can't change it, if the user can't change it. It's mandatory, the owner has set it, that's all you can use that, done. Website for good security awareness materials. I do have a few, so I will pop them up for resources for you. Yep, that's it. I can do that, absolutely. Aha, does CSU offer us Cisco courses? Indeed we do. So we have a CCNA version 3 online course that we did a little while. How long ago was that, Guy? A couple of months? Well,
yeah, it was October. October.
Yeah, October, there you go. So, and that's still available to you through the same Moodle website as you're accessing this one. So you can enroll that. So if you go to the IT Masters website and have a look at the short courses, you can enroll in that CCNA version 3. All the resources are still available there. Obviously the course is finished, but all the resources are available there for you to look at. And that's based on the current CCNA level exam, if you're interested in that.
Do any of the master degree subjects have a big element of that?
They do. So ITE 526, which is Internet Working Fundamentals, that is basically a Cisco-centric course. Cisco-centric subject, I should say.
Cool.
Yep. So we look at, in that, and that's running this session actually, so in that we look at internetworking, big picture and principles, but we implement it using Cisco-centric technology. So there's lots of hands-on stuff in that particular subject. So really reasonably popular subject, and it has been running for quite some time. So good one to get into if you're interested in networking specifically.
Still 40 odd questions. They're still flooding in. But I was just wondering, was there something that you wanted to come back to from earlier? The question about CAD triangle, Windows, Linux, and how it applies to group policy?
So group policy. Yeah, well, I mean, group policy is a methodology, if you like, for implementing specific access restrictions or specific restrictions on either users or computers or functions that they have access to. So again, it comes down to that confidentiality. It's clearly involved with confidentiality, because if group policy restricts you from accessing a certain resource or application or device, then it's generally for a reason. So that doesn't give you access to it. It maintains the confidentiality of that particular resource. Again, integrity, same sort of thing. If you don't have rights to something, you can't inadvertently or deliberately change it. Therefore, it maintains the integrity of that particular resource. And that availability comes about because if you are given access via group policy, then you have availability to that object. If that particular part of the group policy is compromised for some reason and you don't have availability to it, that then is clearly the opposite of availability. So you don't have access to it, you're impacted as a user. So I think if you sit down and think about what the role of any of these sort of security mechanisms are, whether it's, if you look at Active Directory as a whole, if you look at group policy, if you look at access list, firewall rule sets, even if you look at a contact center script for answering phone calls, you can apply the concepts of CIA and DAD to almost anything. If you think about it from the information perspective and the flow of information from one individual or entity to another. And that's a really good question that's been posed there, and I think it brings up that broader concept of everything that I talk about over the next 4 weeks. See if you can apply or work out how CIA DAD applies to it, because I guarantee that it will in some way, because everything we talk about involves flow of information or access to information. And when that's the case, CIA DAD is intrinsically linked to whatever mechanism is that you're looking at. But given that question's been raised and there's been a couple of others that of a similar ilk, if you like, I will continue to reinforce that over the next 3 weeks and give you examples or reasoning as to why certain things that I talk about relate to CIA DAD. Really good question and a thought-provoking one, and hopefully that will generate some thinking for the rest of you. And you know, how do I apply CIA DAD to specific mechanisms or specific contexts? So good, really good questions. Well done, guys. Excellent. So is that it, Guy? I think for the question.
I reckon we'll call it a day. We've had 90 minutes, and I just want to thank everyone for sticking around and asking fantastic questions. Shadi has asked any homework, and no specific homework really. Just have a look at the forums, answer the discussion prompts, and chuck any other interesting questions you have in there. And once you're ready, you can take the Quizlet that Matt's put together. That's a participation hurdle for the exam later on. No rush on that one. But other than that, just thanks heaps, Matt. Really excited to continue this course. Great number of participants, great chat, great questions. So I think it's a mark of an interesting course. So thank you.
No worries at all. And thank you, Guy, for your involvement and your assistance tonight. It's been fantastic. And thank you to everyone who's attended and the questions you've asked. Absolutely fantastic. So thanks, guys. Hopefully see you all back again next week.